Let's start by talking about the Jobs Act, and specifically from your point of view, how will this act help the state of Delaware? Is there a sense of how many jobs or how much revenue it could
Yeah, I don't
bring
know
to the
that
state?
there's a specific sense, but I think there are really two things that will help Delaware. First of all, it will encourage innovation. It will send a signal to small business people who might have a good idea that there's a way to take your company public. And so it will spur innovation and creativity in business. That's number one. And number two, that, Delaware, as the corporate capital of America, has a considerable stake in corporate formation and the growth of corporations. In fact, when IPOs were going strong here in the United States, the state of Delaware was a big beneficiary, because as those companies issue more shares and grow, they pay a higher fee, higher corporate franchise fee to the state of Delaware. One of the groups that identified this problem for me as a member of Congress from Delaware is the folks who run the Division of Corporations here, Rick Eisenberger and the Secretary of State, Jeff Bullock, had identified the decrease in IPOs as a problem affecting corporate formation, corporate growth in America, and therefore corporate franchise tax collections in Delaware. So really two things: innovation, economy, as well as the direct effect on corporate franchise tax to the state of Delaware. And that's just the state. That's just the state of Delaware. We think it'll have larger, similar kinds of effects on the innovation economy and small business development side for states across the country.
Although this bill has garnered a lot of bipartisan support, in the last few days there's been a lot of criticism of it as it prepares to go to President Obama for signature. New York Times editorial called it deeply flawed, and there's been some other criticisms as well. How do you respond to people who are now kind of looking at this bill and are concerned about the impact it might have on investors getting involved in these IPOs?
Well, first of all, it's just not accurate. They're using misinformation. And the basic misrepresentation is that the bill completely exempts companies, small emerging growth companies, from these regulations. That's not the approach it takes. In fact, there were amendments that were offered by Republican members in the House Financial Services Committee that would in fact have done just that, would have exempted companies under a certain size indefinitely from the most onerous provision of Sarbanes-Oxley, what's called a 404B audit, which is just an audit of audits is what it is, which can be very expensive. And the concept of the bill is, as companies are small and less revenue, they're growing, let's give them a few years to get on their feet and develop a revenue stream and profitability so that they can afford that, and that's what the bill does, until companies get to be a certain size or within 5 years, and then they're subject to those provisions. So it's really a common sense approach, doesn't exempt indefinitely, and I think that's where the critics are wrong, and they misrepresent what the bill does in that respect. And we saw a lot of that in the debate in the Senate. I think it also shines a light on one of the problems with our process and how it's broken in Delaware. One side or the other, or both sides, they see a middle ground for an approach to some of these problems, and they criticize it from both sides. And therefore, members are less likely to take this kind of common sense approach to those problems, because they're going to be criticized by one side or the other for not fitting the narrative on that respective side.
I did want to hit the one example a lot of people have been using in their criticism. That is the Groupon example, that there's a lot of questions about their accounting and fuzzy math there, and they've used that as kind of the example of what this bill could create by rolling back some of or phasing in some of these regulations. You don't see it the same way.
I don't. First of all, there's nothing that is even ramped up that recuses anybody from accounting irregularities. There's nothing in the bill that does that. There was a provision early in the bill that would enable companies to adopt changes in accounting rules more gradually. We took that out. There were people who, on both sides of the aisle, who objected to that, and we thought, maybe that's not a good idea, so we took it out by an amendment. The biggest thing that's addressed in the bill is the 404B audit, which is basically an audit of internal audits. Okay, so it doesn't affect the audits themselves, just the audit of the audits. Some people would argue that it's redundant and overkill at any rate. That's not the argument we made. We just said allow companies to grow and develop the capability to manage the cost associated with that. So I just think that with respect to Groupon, in fact, as I understand the size of the company, wouldn't even apply because Groupon's too big or was too big. So to make that argument, excuse me, using a company that doesn't even fit the criteria of the bill seems a little disingenuous to me.
You mentioned at the beginning the impact on incorporation in Delaware. Are you concerned that Delaware's stature as an incorporation kind of capital is waning?
Not so much as a capital of corporate formation, but some of that in the recession has flattened out and fallen off. But the concern that gave rise to this IPO on-ramp bill was the decline in initial public offerings for public companies here in the U.S. over the last 10 or more years. So it's two things there. You know, the research suggests that 92% of job growth happens after a company goes public. So if companies aren't going public in the U.S., if they're choosing some foreign exchange or foreign company in which to do that, the state of Delaware and the United States is losing out on those jobs that will be created. The state of Delaware will also lose out in terms of revenue that they wouldn't realize. So that's really more what it is, not so much whether people would incorporate here. In fact, a lot of the companies, new companies, would be incorporated here first, go to IPO, and then grow and therefore pay more. So it's more the growth of those companies that may already be incorporated in Delaware.
Given that decline you mentioned, is it important for Delaware, in addition to doing things like this, to help bolster incorporation?
Absolutely.
Is it important to also look at other things that the state can do as revenue generators, so the state is not as reliant on these revenues?
No question about it. And in fact, when I was Secretary of State, Secretary of Finance, excuse me, one of the big concerns that the rating agencies had as we sought to have our credit rating improve from AA+ to AAA, which is the highest you can be, which we are now and have been since late 1999, in the latter part of my tenure as Secretary of Finance when Tom Carper was governor, is the lack of diversity within the revenue streams of the state. So the historical concern has always been Delaware's too reliant on personal income tax, which tends to fluctuate up and down with the economy and unemployment, right? So you don't want to be that dependent on a revenue source that goes up and down. As it turns out, so we've become less dependent on personal income tax. We had the lottery and the video lottery that grew revenue considerably. We've had abandoned property, which is related to corporate franchise tax, which has grown. And we've had the addition of the bank franchise tax and its growth, and then corporate franchise tax and its growth over the last 20 years. So the revenue streams have been diversified. The reliance on corporate franchise tax is not such a bad thing as corporate income tax because it tends to steadily go up. Okay. It doesn't drop off so significantly during a recession as your personal income taxes would do. So overall diversity, absolutely a critical thing. And relying on revenue sources that tend to be steady when the economy goes south is a good thing, and the corporate franchise tax tends to be that way.
Having gotten the Jobs Act through, where do you go next in terms of trying to create jobs, create a more positive economic atmosphere?
Yeah, the biggest thing, and I've been saying it since I was elected, is that we need a transportation bill. That you might as well call it a transportation jobs bill, because it provides funding for states and local transportation and transit authorities to improve transportation infrastructure. The only way to improve transportation infrastructure is to do transportation projects and put people to work. Not in government jobs, but in contractors, engineering firms that plan and develop those projects, and then the contractors and construction firms that actually do the work in the field. We need one. We should have had one before now. It's frankly ridiculous that Democrats and Republicans have not been able to get together on a long-term transportation bill. And that's not to say that there aren't issues. One of the issues is the funding of it, as is always the case it seems like, in Washington. How are you going to pay for things? And we need to pay for things. Well, we need basic infrastructure, so we need to find ways to pay for it. There's a 2-year bill that's passed the Senate. The House has been working on like a 5-year bill. So we need to come together on some. We just passed a 90-day extension. That's not the way to do business. I didn't vote for it for that reason, that we ought to be either passing the 2-year bill from the Senate or trying to get the Senate to agree on the 5-year bill that's come out of the House, or some version of it.
Concerned that those type of things are going to be stalled through the remainder of this year because of it being an election
I hope
year?
not. I mean, a lot of the pundits and people who follow these things always say, yeah, well, we're not going to get anything done. Well, look, if you just concede that up front, you're not going to get anything done.
Mm.
And so I just can't concede that with respect to transportation, because it's a jobs bill. I mean, one of the reasons that some of the Democratic leaders criticized the Jobs Act that we talked about a minute ago is because it wasn't comprehensive enough, and it wasn't. But let's go on to the next thing and work hand in glove with the Republicans to try to come up with a transportation plan and a funding plan that actually works and will create jobs, create certainty for state governments and for engineering and construction firms. That's what we need to do, and it shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't be an issue around which Democrats and Republicans would disagree so much. It's basic infrastructure. We've always came together to fund those kinds of projects, and we need them. You just look around our state. The transportation and infrastructure needs that we have are significant.
Congressman John Carney, we appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to be here.